Actually, I think I've never attended a conference that really focuses on literature and ethics. I mean, there are a lot of literary conferences, but not specifically on literature and ethics. So this is really a wonderful opportunity. Yeah, and two of our PhD students are here as well. And so later on, maybe they can answer some of our questions. So I just want to introduce them, Dominic and Waikit. They are also from my institution. Okay, so let me share my slides. Yeah, so today I'm going to be touching on 3 points, starting with 3 reasons why I think literature and ethics is vital and urgent today. Then I'm going to be talking about 3 movements that I see, traditions emerging from the East and the West. And finally, I'm going to give some examples on how we can do this in our classrooms. I'm assuming there's a mix of people who are practitioners and scholars as well. So hopefully there's a balance between the theory and the practice as well. Okay, so let me start with 3 reasons why literature and ethical engagement is important. And anytime if you can't hear me or don't see my slides moving, just let me know. Okay, so the first reason, and I work at the National Institute of Education, so we work a lot with schools. The first reason is that aesthetic criticism continues to dominate the assessment and teaching of literature in schools. You can just look at the IB, which is the International Baccalaureate, or the IGCSE. These are the major high-stakes assessment. And you'll see that one of the common components is about critical appreciation of text. And one component is that's typical in all these assessments is the unseen, where students have to critique a text for the first time. One of the most common questions is what we call the author analysis question. Okay, so some examples are this. It's typically phrased like, how does the writer do something? Like, how does the writer make this sonnet moving? Or how does Jennings use words and imagery? Or how does this writer create a vivid impression or make something moving? Now, these questions actually push students to look at the style, the form, the genre, the language of the text. But what's missing is any engagement with the ethics of the text. So a second reason why literature and ethics is important is because aesthetic criticism tends to hide what is called the politics and the ethics of text. If we look closely at aesthetic criticism, it concerns the critical evaluations of a text. And key movements are aestheticism from the late 19th century, new criticism from the 1930s, 40s, formalism, structuralism, stylistics. What's common in all these movements is this promotion of disinterestedness. This word disinterested reading comes from the new critics. Let me give a quote from I.A. Richards, who is one of the most prominent figures in new criticism. And he sees art as a kind of communication. So if art is all about communication, then we should just pay attention to the formal elements, meaning its style, its structure, its language. And so then this results in a kind of impersonality. The critic must be objective and detached. And so then we can focus on the text alone. Now, what is the problem with this? The problem with this is that it draws attention away from the politics of the text, because the text is not just made up of words. It's not just a text meant to communicate. It also has hidden ideology. So as Terry Eagleton says, reading poetry in the new critical way means committing yourself to nothing. All that poetry taught you was disinterestedness, a serene, speculative, even-handed rejection of anything in particular. It was, in other words, a recipe for political inertia and submission to the political status quo. And I think a lot of post-colonial scholars have written about this. I think this is a wonderful book. If you can read it, get your hands on it. It's by Gauri Vishwanathan from Columbia University. And she has written about the history of English studies in India. And I have also written about the history of English studies in Singapore. Both were colonized by the British. And one of the commonalities is the way the British use English literature to inculcate English values through the pedagogy of aesthetic criticism. It functioned as a kind of cultural colonization because the locals were never taught to question the text. They were taught to appreciate the text in a detached, passive way. So I think many of us may be familiar with this iceberg diagram. If we only pay attention to the surface level of the text, its plot, its character, its style, its setting, its genre, we are looking at its explicit meaning. We are looking at what is observable. But what we neglect is its implicit meaning, its values, its motivations, its bias, its assumptions, its influences. That is the domain of ethics. And that is the domain of ethics that we need to pay attention to. So I think what I'm arguing for is not that we neglect aesthetics. We still need to pay attention to it, but I think it needs to be balanced with attention to ethics as well. And I would argue that ethics is integrated and integral to aesthetics. You cannot escape from ethics when you deal with literature. Proponents of aesthetic criticism and from the movement of aestheticism will say that the moral content of a work of art has little to do with the value or the pleasure of an artwork. When you talk about literature, you shouldn't talk about anything to do with morality and ethics, and that's what they would argue, someone like Richard Posner, okay? But this is a flawed argument, because if you ask any writer, right, any well-known writer, most often they start writing because of an ethical reason. It could be to convey an intention, to contest justice, injustice or discrimination, to engage with social and political concerns. And so integral to literary texts are cultural values, ethical choices and dilemmas, and ethical concerns of the real world. And that is why writers write in the first place. So to say that the content of an artwork has nothing to do with ethics is a flawed argument. So as Wayne Booth says, literature is a platform for applied ethics. If we can see stories as virtual cases that we will face in the real world, then, that is where we need to think about how we can engage students both with the aesthetics of the text as well as its ethical concerns. Okay, so these are three reasons why I think literature and ethical engagement is important, and that is my introduction. I want to talk now about this movement of ethical criticism that emerged, from the late 20th century. And I want to distill three particular traditions coming from the East and West. Okay, so I think we look at it historically. Ethical criticism isn't new. It's something that goes all the way back to ancient Greece. A very good text to look at is Plato's Protagoras, where you can see that they are doing close reading. They are looking at words and language in a poem, but they are engaging with ethical questions and philosophy. So that is an early example of ethical criticism. But I want to look now at contemporary ethical criticism that kind of gained a revival in the late 20th century, particularly 1980s, following the decline of post-structuralist criticism. I think essentially people became a little bit disillusioned with post-structuralist criticism. It was very popular in the 1970s, but scholars began to question, post-structuralism is all about dismantling the text, all about interrogating and deconstructing the text. There was a lack of commitment to ethical issues and ethical questions about justice and human rights. So around the 1980s, some of the key literary scholars in the world, right, they started to write about literature's connection to ethics. For example, Derrida, his later works, right, was all about hospitality and cosmopolitanism. Gayatri Spivak, a post-colonial scholar, and her concept of planetarity and how we need to think within and beyond national borders, how we need to question the borders we use in our interrogations of text. Judith Butler's recent works have to do with violence and violence as interpretive. And Terry Eagleton's also later works was about ethics and politics. So a lot of these major literary scholars started writing about ethics, literature and ethics. And this was complemented by a lot of volumes, edited volumes, articles Their main argument was that we need to recognize we live in an increasingly globally diverse world, that values are conflicting and they are complex, and literature can play a relevant role in facilitating dispositions of empathy and hospitality. Literature can promote what Paulo Freire calls conscientization, or the critical consciousness of exploitation. Literature can be the catalyst to, when reading the word becomes the platform for reading the world and its injustices. Okay, so in summary, what is ethical criticism? This is a quote from my book, Teaching Ethics Through Literature. And I define ethical criticism as a critical hermeneutical approach to reading texts that analyzes representation and construction of ethical values, how processes of othering and marginalization occur in specific social and geopolitical contexts, and how text can offer an entry point to engaging with ethical issues in the community and the world. In other words, it involves an aesthetic, political, and ethical analysis of text, readers, and others in an interactional process. So in summary, ethical criticism is not just about ethics, it's about aesthetics, politics, and ethics. I think these three are important. The art of the text, the ideology of the text, the ethical values in the text. And these three must be integral in our engagement with any text. And this framework you see on the right are just some of the skills that we tap on when we are reading texts, right? The critical skills like interpretation, analysis, evaluation, the interrogative, creative skills like responding, questioning, and imagining text, and the ethical skills like connecting text to other texts, to issues in society and the world, and to ethical philosophy. Okay, so far so good, right? So now I want to talk about three approaches. I just want to qualify that East and West are not monolithic terms because there are so many traditions and cultures and religions in these locations, so they cannot be seen as one group. So I'm going to be a bit more specific now. I'm going to talk about relational ethical criticism. This specific movement emerged from American scholars in the 1980s, okay? And then I'm going to talk about historical ethical criticism, which emerged from scholars in China, specifically a group of scholars in China in the 2000s. And finally, what I call cosmopolitan ethical criticism from scholars in US, UK, and Singapore, and around the world. We have been writing about this since the late 1990s. So let's talk about relational ethical criticism first. I think when I mentioned the turn to ethics in the 1980s, this movement was spearheaded by a group of American scholars. I think one of the most prominent was Wayne Booth, and he wrote a lot of articles in his book, The Company We Keep. And so Wayne Booth talks about stories as friends. Okay, that when we go to a story, it's like meeting a friend for the first time. And fictional characters influence our dispositions. Even if we don't like them, the book has already influenced us, just like friends influence us. They shape our desires, our gratifications. When we become invested in a book, we don't realize that our ethical values are being shaped. So I think what's very interesting about him is he talks about two ways to approach a text. The first approach is openness. When you meet a text for the first time, it's like meeting a friend. You suspend judgment. You allow yourself to be taken into the narrative world. You immerse yourself into that world. But after the reading of the text, you then distance yourself from that world and you critique the aesthetics and ethical values of that text. Okay, so another influential scholar is Marshall Gregory. Like Wayne Booth, he uses this idea of relating to a text, right? This relational idea. Okay, so text and readers form an ethical relationship. And he uses the idea of ethical invitations. When you look at a text, the literary text invites you to share certain feelings with characters, to share certain beliefs about what is right or wrong, moral or immoral behavior, and to share judgments about ethical concerns. So I think this movement was very influential, and I think gave a lot of very good strategies to reading. And then around 2000, a group of Chinese scholars led by Professor Nai Zhenzhao, right, countered this movement. Actually, a lot of their writings kind of criticize this American ethical criticism or relational ethical criticism. Until now, it is, I would say, a dominant approach among Chinese literary scholars. And they use this method to examine canonical and contemporary works until today. It is still very influential. There is a whole community there. There are conferences, journals, all dedicated to this Chinese approach to ethical criticism. I call this historical ethical criticism, and I'll explain why I call it historical ethical criticism. Its main criticism of American ethical criticism is that when you relate to a text as a friend, and then later you distance yourself and evaluate it, you tend to evaluate it based on your own moral values. In other words, we tend to impose our ethical standards when you read a text. And consequently, instead of appreciating the ethics of that text, you end up imposing your values and reinforcing your own cultural superiority. So let me give an example of this. So I observed this social studies class in a US high school some years ago. The teacher was teaching about Afghanistan. And then halfway through, she was talking about women in Afghanistan, okay? And then she said, what have we learned about how women are treated by the Taliban in Afghanistan? They were not allowed to wear makeup. They banned girls from reading. They forced women who were professors to quit their job. They had to wear a burqa. They had to be completely covered. And then she said, maybe I should teach this lesson completely covered. So like you see in the picture, she puts on this burqa. And one of the students said, you look like you should be carrying a scythe or something. A scythe is like, basically you are like a satanic figure, a devil. So you can see this is an example of how in this class, they were supposed to appreciate the culture of women in Afghanistan, the culture of Afghanistan. But instead of this, they are imposing basically American values. They're imposing American values about how women should be in their reading of a foreign culture. So I think this is one of the main criticisms that the Chinese had, okay? And so they came up with their own historical ethical criticism and basically argued that ethical literary criticism is defined as a critical theory for reading, analyzing, interpreting the ethical nature and function of literary works from the perspective of ethics. By seeing literature as a product of morality, it argues that literature is a form of ethical expression in a specific historical situation. Literature is, in essence, an art of ethics. So let me distill some of the key concepts that they are talking about. Okay, first, I think what's interesting is the distinction between moral criticism and ethical criticism. So for Nai, moral criticism is when you evaluate a text and say whether it's good or bad, or character is good or bad, based on your own moral values, based on your society's moral values. And he says this is flawed because you are imposing your moral values on the text. So ethical criticism, on the other hand, emphasizes historicism, which is try to understand the historical context of the time and how that historical context gives rise to particular ethical values, and use that as a lens to interpreting the text instead of your own ethical values. So there's also a distinction between historical criticism and ethical criticism. So even though I call this historical ethical criticism, it is different from historical criticism. Historical criticism in lit theory focuses on the history of textual production, redaction, or the editing of the text, the reception of the text. But historical ethical criticism looks at historical context as a starting point to understand the ethical perspectives of that particular culture in that particular time and space. Okay, so I think Nai goes further to talk about 6 things that we can observe in a text. When we look at the history and the context of that text, we can look at the ethical environment, the ethical identity, how people make ethical choices, ethical taboos, ethical dilemmas, ethical boundaries, like who's included, who's excluded, the ethical ends or the ethical goals, deconstruction, and ethical consciousness. So these are concepts we can use when students kind of read ethics in a text of a particular time. I think what's also very interesting in this approach is also they try to problematize the boundaries between literature, history, and philosophy. So Nai argues that if you look at pre-Qing dynasty in China, literature was not, poetry, prose, and drama. Literature included historical text and philosophy. And so we should return to this more interdisciplinary idea of literature when we engage in text. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to the last movement that I call cosmopolitan ethical criticism. This is a movement that I have written a lot about. It emerged in the late 20th century. It's grounded on the ideas of the French-Lithuanian philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. In some ways, it finds affinity and similarity with relational ethical criticism and historical ethical criticism that I mentioned. First, I think it talks about being open to the other, especially when you first encounter a text. You don't judge it, you suspend judgment, you immerse yourself, and you be open to the other, especially those who are foreign, marginalized. It also finds similarity with historical criticism because it's about how you can empathize with the other and the other's historical situatedness rather than coming from yourself. Like you try to transcend your ego and your culture by understanding the other's situatedness. But it is also distinct from these two approaches, okay? So first, unlike relational ethical criticism, cosmopolitan ethical criticism argues that the relationship between reader and other is not equal. In fact, Levinas talks a lot about this other-centric philosophy in which the other should be given priority. And as readers, we have an ethical obligation to the other. We must be accountable to the other. And that is our initial orientation to the text. Unlike historical ethical criticism also, cosmopolitan ethical criticism goes beyond an understanding of the fictional world of the text and privileges real encounters with others in the world. The problem with the Chinese historical ethical criticism is that it focuses a lot about the history and the ethical values of the fictional text. But for Levinas, ethics belongs to the real world. It is about real encounters. And so the question is, as we read a fictional text, how do we transfer empathy from the fictional world to the other in the real world? We are reading about migrant workers in a poem. How do you relate that to real migrant workers who are living in your community? This is the idea of transference of empathy from fiction to reality. And I think most significantly, unlike these two approaches, cosmopolitan ethical criticism does not romanticize literature. In fact, Levinas has a not so positive view about literature. He says that literature is a shadow. It's incomplete. When literature represents the other, it is not a complete or correct or truthful representation of the other. Art captivates the reader to become passive, to become immersed in the fictional world. And by doing so, we escape responsibility, real responsibility to the other. Levinas also distinguishes art criticism or aesthetic criticism that focuses on the aesthetic qualities of the text versus what he calls philosophical exegesis or ethical criticism, which he describes as something that is committed to real accountability with marginalized and diverse others. And that's why there's a cosmopolitan angle to his writing. So what is the task of ethical criticism in terms of its pedagogy? A major pedagogical approach is what we call interruption. The task of ethical criticism is actually to interrupt any representations of the other in the work. So we teach students to, for example, identify prejudice depictions. So how fiction may participate in othering. We problematize any kind of closure in interpretation. We interrupt by providing multiple and alternative perspectives of the other. And we push for connections to real-world ethical concerns. Okay, so in other words, cosmopolitan ethical criticism challenges the self to break out of its own self-absorption into accountability for others in the world. And in this way, criticism becomes active rather than passive. It's a catalyst for activism rather than just appreciating a text or analyzing a text. It is a platform or a launch pad for real-world social justice activism. Okay. So finally, I think in my last part, and just give me another 10 minutes, I want to give some very practical examples on what this means for the teaching of literature. Okay, so I just want to say that all three approaches are valid. And actually, as literature teachers, we need to have a versatility. We need to have a repertoire of pedagogical approaches. The expert teachers that research has shown are those that know when to use the right approach for the right situation. Okay, and they have that discernment. The idea is how you push students from superficial to deep ethical inquiry. And you need sometimes to use relational approaches, historical approaches, and cosmopolitan approaches. You need all three. Okay, so my metaphor of the literature teachers is the cosmopolitan explorer, navigator, and cartographer. We are always charting new pathways for our students, right? We find ways to open the classroom for them to explore the world, and we learn with and for our students. So let me give some examples now. I'm going to use picture books because they are more visual, and I think picture books are not just for children. I also use them for young adults and even in my graduate courses because some of them are highly ethical, highly philosophical. Okay, so this is a picture book on called The Paper Boat. It's about refugees and asylum seekers. So how do we apply relational ethical criticism? First, when we approach a text, right? Very likely your students are not refugees, unless you are in a international school. Okay, so get students to have an open stance, suspend disbelief, immerse themselves in the world of the text, and try to adopt the gaze of the other. Even though they don't understand who are refugees, right? Try to consider how these people may be feeling. Why does the author describe them like ants? Why does the author describe their boat like a paper? Okay, how is the writer inviting you to feel for them? Okay, and then flow with the invitations that the text is offering you. How is this text inviting you to share certain beliefs, like beliefs about home, stability, security? What are the values this text is asking you to share? How is this text inviting you to judge the world that the refugees live in? So after the reading of the text, then we step outside of the text and we might want to critique the text. We might want to ask, how is the author representing refugees? Is it credible? Is it representative? Is he victimizing them? Are there alternative narratives that can counter this? Okay, so this is relational ethical criticism. And historical ethical criticism, this is another wonderful picture book by a Singaporean author, and it's called The Amazing Sarong. A sarong is a dress worn by Malay communities and others, especially in Southeast Asia. Okay, so people may not be familiar, especially people from other parts of the world, may not have heard of what is this dress called the sarong. So this is where we try to understand the culture, right? Conduct historical inquiry in the cultural setting. Where and when is the story taking place? What culture is this depicting? And what do we know about this culture? What are the taboos? We can apply 6 concepts, right? The ethical environment, the ethical taboos. What are the ethical choices, the ethical values of this culture? Okay. And in this picture book, they talk about different uses of the sarong. So here on the right, you see the children using the sarong as a hat. On the middle picture, they use the sarong as a roof. The third picture, they use the sarong as a bag. So sarong is used for many reasons, not just a dress. So conduct research. Why does this occur in this culture? Who wears them? Why was it invented? How has it evolved over time? How has it changed? Okay, and what does it then say about this particular culture? What other forms of dressing are unique to this particular culture? Okay, so these are the intertextual connections they can make. Okay, and finally, cosmopolitan ethical criticism. I suggest doing this last because it facilitates a more skeptical and critical stance. Okay, it may be more applicable after the relational and historical approaches. Okay, so some questions to ask would be, how is a particular race, gender, class, group represented? Okay, very simply looking first at bias and stereotypes. Are there alternative narratives? I recently saw this Instagram post. It's on To Kill a Mockingbird, and the character of Lula in To Kill a Mockingbird. So Lula in To Kill a Mockingbird is a minor figure. In fact, I've never noticed her all this, even though I've taught the book before. So she's described as a tall Negro woman, strange almond eyes, 7 feet high, and so on. So I think, when you look at the depictions of Lula, she actually references stereotypical ideas of superhumanized Black people. And in the novel, Lula is portrayed negatively. Why is she portrayed negatively? In fact, one of the characters called Calpurnia calls her a N-word, okay? She's portrayed negatively because she's assertive. She questions the presence of whiteness. She's bold in her opinions. Okay, she's independent. And we can ask, Harper Lee as a white woman gives Lula a negative portrait because she questions whiteness. Is this a valid comment or is this a biased comment? Okay. So we can ask, even though Harper Lee, for example, is speaking up against African American racism, is she herself complicit, okay, in promoting racism? So who is the real other the implied author is speaking for? Okay, conduct research on the issues he may face, encourage real encounters by interviewing or listening to interviews of this other. Okay, so other questions we can ask is, how does the narrative contribute to the othering of a marginal group? So I've given the example of To Kill a Mockingbird. This is another example. This is a very popular YA lit called Shabanu by Suzanne Staples. And it depicts this Muslim woman. So New York Times says it's powerful, it's touching, it's won awards. But if you look at criticisms from the Islamic community, they say, it is full of stereotypes. It is the imposition of a Western romance storyline into something that depicts Muslim communities negatively. Okay, so we can think about how is the text ironically othering this marginal group, even though it tries to claim that it's speaking for it. Another thing is reflexivity. How am I imposing my own values and interpretive practices onto this culture as depicted in the text? And finally, this idea of cosmopolitanism is about real encounters. So how do I address ethical injustices faced by this community? What can I do about this? Who are the real others in the world that are facing these kinds of discrimination, and what can I and my community do? Okay. So this is my last slide. This is one of my favorite quotes by Emmanuel Levinas. A lot of his most powerful writing emerged after the Holocaust. He himself was thrown in a concentration camp. And one of the things he says is, when you have encountered a human being, you cannot drop him. Most often we do, saying, I have done all I could. We haven't done anything. Okay, so literature is about encountering human beings, right? We encounter fictional others in the text. The author is also an other. The readers we discuss are also others. So literature is about encounters with human beings. And the question we ask is, what is the role of ethical criticism? I think ethical criticism involves a variety of strategies, and I've given some today. But ultimately, what these aim at is the continual process of demonstrating what it means to be open, to be empathetic, and to be hospitable and responsible to others in the world. And this involves that continual process of interrupting. Every time we think we've done enough, we haven't. That continual process of asking, what else can we do? What else can we do to make this world, a better place, to defend the rights of others, to enable another person to flourish? And I think that is the task of literature. Okay. If you're interested, this is a book I published last year, Teaching Ethics Through Literature. And here's my website, SuzanneChoo.com, which has videos and other resources as well. Okay. Finally, these are the references cited in this presentation. Okay, thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions.